Well, should we get started? I think that's all we're going to get, right? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. And can you see my PowerPoint coming up?
Yes.
Good? All right. So Julie reached out to me on Wednesday this week and said, hey, would you be willing to give the webinar this week? And I said, for sure. I've been eager to talk about this topic for quite some time. I'm going to put this up at full screen. Is that still showing up okay?
Yes.
I changed my title a little bit since I had to get it together just on Wednesday. I was thinking more about it, but I'm going to tell a story about a really interesting project that we've had that's collaborative between DOE EM and DOE LM. So EM does remediation, construction, environmental management. Essentially, DOE environmental management does the remediation and construction. When they're done, they turn projects over to LM, which is legacy management. And this project really represents a connection between those two, trying to understand first how well some of the constructive facilities function that EM is designing and building, and then how should we manage them down the road so that we can get a more optimal outcome from the facility. And this topic in particular focuses on containment of uranium mill tailings. And for those of you who are less familiar with uranium mill tailings, I'll talk about what they are in a minute. But containment systems, for particularly final covers. The uranium mill tailings use a unique type of cover over the disposal facility called an armored cover. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And there's been some assumptions that armored covers don't suffer some of the other issues that unarmored covers have been observed to experience in past research and studies. And this experiment was one, to look at that issue, and then to, secondly, and more importantly, understand how we should manage these systems better so that they give us superior performance. So just a little bit about uranium ore and mill tailings, if you're not familiar with that. Uranium ore is a rock. We excavate it from the ground. It's uraninite, or pitch blende is perhaps the more colloquial name. It's a rock that's rich in uranium and other elements. We excavate that from the ground. We grind it. So you grind that rock into fine particles that are really sand to silt size. And we do that at a uranium mill. And we will mix that with an acid solution, and we'll extract uranium from the ore, and we'll convert that into something called yellowcake. That's shown here down in the lower left-hand corner. And that yellowcake would then be might be used to make fuel rods for a nuclear reactor, or it might be used to make weapons. And the early work that led to a lot of the uranium mill tailings that I'm going to talk about today actually was for weapons production, and later transitioned into peaceful civilian nuclear power production at a later date. When we extract uranium from uranium ore, from something like pitch blende, we actually just extract a few percent of the mass. It's a really small part of the mass that actually gets extracted and turned into yellowcake. About 97% or so ends up as waste. So 97% of that rock, which will be ground up, mixed with a very strong solution, will become waste, and we call that uranium mill tailings. And you'll see at a uranium mill, for example, one that I've been working at for over the last decade or so, you'll have very large ponds full of this liquid. Hundreds of acres of uranium mill tailings that are the byproduct or the waste product from production of uranium, production of yellowcake. And historically, back in the 50s and 60s, today we manage those ponds very carefully, but 50s and 60s, essentially that waste liquid and waste solid just went out the back. And we had very little control over it. We had many locations where we had extensive contamination associated with uranium mill tailings, and also uncontrolled sources of radiation, which presented a safety hazard. As part of a broader set of environmental legislation that occurred in the 1970s in the United States, one piece of legislation that was passed is something called the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act, or UMTRCA. This was passed in 1978, and it authorized the United States Environmental Protection Agency to establish health and environmental standards to manage uranium mill waste. Title I of UMTRCA was particularly important because it established remedial action program for 22 inactive uranium mill sites, largely in the Western United States, most of which were associated historically with weapons production from the Manhattan Project and later on from the Cold War. And of those 22 sites, 40 million cubic meters of low-level radioactive material was going to be moved and disposed of in so-called UMTRCA Title I holding cells, which meant a disposal facility or a landfill. But it was this Radiation Control Act that led to essentially cleanup of these sites and construction of large disposal facilities for the uranium mill tailings, and all the other stuff that was contaminated at these sites were put into these so-called holding cells. Ooh. Get this to move forward. Well, what's a uranium UMTRCA disposal facility look like? It's actually a very simple facility, largely in part because they were developed in the late 70s, going into the 80s, when our understanding of how to design and construct disposal facilities and engineer barriers associated with them was really in its infancy. They're different than many other types of landfills that we would use for municipal waste or hazardous waste or so-called mixed waste, which is hazardous mixed with radioactive waste, in that they typically are not lined. We'll have a depression in the ground, will be filled with uranium mill tailings. They will tend to be dewatered, placed in the disposal facility, compacted in place, and then a cover is installed on the top over the uranium mill tailings that has a very important function. Importantly, as I mentioned, typically there's no lining system. If we were designing a hazardous waste landfill or a municipal solid waste landfill, we would have a lining system in the bottom, very sophisticated lining system to minimize leakage. The thinking was in UMTRCA and the early UMTRCA designs was that since these facilities had to last for millennia, our ability to have a liner at the base that would collect water and the ability to extract and treat water collecting at the base on a liner would not likely be occurring for an entire 1,000-year period. The idea that we're going to pump and treat leachate out of one of these facilities was an unlikely scenario. And the philosophy then was, if we can't guarantee that we can pump and treat leachate from these facilities for 1,000 years, we ought to plan for movement through the facility and discharge into groundwater. And more importantly, let's not put any type of liner at the bottom, which would allow water to build up and have essentially a long-term contact with the waste form. And so the efficacy of this system, since it has no liner at all, depends completely on one engineered barrier. That's the final cover at the top over the waste. It has to control water percolation into the waste, ultimately controlling the flux to groundwater, because the rate at which water enters the waste over the long term will equal the flux to groundwater out the base. That cover also has to control the egress of radon. So uranium mill tailings, not only they have radionuclides in them, they will be transported down to groundwater, but they also are in a gaseous form in radon gas, which actually migrates up and out of the facility in the atmosphere. So that cover actually has two different functions: water control downward, radon flux control upward. We're going to talk today about water percolation rates, and later we could talk about radon flux control as well. We actually finished a project, DOE EM LM, combined with U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission collaborative project to study the long-term efficacy of these barrier systems for radon fluxes as well. And we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to focus on water percolation, but at a later date, I would like to share that. But it's important that the final cover in this system is the final line of defense. If the cover is effective at controlling percolation into the uranium melt tailings, we will be able to control the flux to groundwater to a very low level. On the other hand, if it transmits a considerable amount of water into the melt tailings, we can expect a considerable amount of flux out the base as well. So the final cover really has critically important functions. In this discussion today, it's about percolation, but as I mentioned, it's radon flux as well. About 10 years after UMTRCO was originally promulgated in 1978, DOE issued a guidance document on how UMTRCO final covers should be designed and constructed. This is a 1989 strategy. And the cover profile looks like the one shown here on the left. I should remark that that guidance document in 1989 is essentially many of the same principles that are applied today until just the last few years based on some of the experience that we've seen. But the cover profile is somewhat unique relative to what's used at other sites. The surface is a layer of riprap, so that's this large stone. That's meant for long-term erosion control. Part of the thinking was that the primary failure mechanism would be long-term erosion through the cover, breaching the underlying radon barriers and ultimately getting into the waste. So a riprap surface, that's got a bedding layer underneath that, that's essentially a coarse textured layer, but finer than the riprap in which the riprap sits. Beneath that is a frost protection layer, a fine textured layer, about 0.6 meters thick, that's really meant to protect the underlying radon barrier from freezing and thawing, because we know freezing and thawing can be really detrimental to clay barriers. The radon barrier below the frost protection layer, it's 0.6 meters thick. It's meant to have low hydraulic conductivity and low diffusion coefficient for radon gas control. So low hydraulic conductivity to control water percolation down, and low gas diffusivity to control radon flux up. We're just gonna talk about the hydraulic component today. And underneath that is a transition layer, essentially a foundation layer that would be on top of the underlying uranium melt tailings. And the key element in this system that's controlling all the fluxes is this radon barrier. This 2-foot thick compacted clay barrier that's meant to control the percolation rate down and the gas flux up. And the thinking was, at least in western parts of the United States, and there's published literature on this, that this system would control percolation rates to on the order of 0 to 3 millimeters per year. So you think 3 millimeters, a pen tip is about 0.5 millimeters. So you're talking about just a small fraction of water migrating through the system in a given year. And importantly, that it would function for at least 1,000 years. At least 1,000 years, and maintain that low percolation rate. Another component of this system was that they're managed to prevent vegetation from establishing. One line of thought was that if vegetation would establish in the riprap, even though the riprap doesn't look like a hospitable home for vegetation, it can and will establish, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But the conventional approach was to manage that surface with herbicide to prevent any ingress of vegetation, to preclude rooting down into the system, with the thinking being that if roots made their way down to the radon barrier, they would introduce structure into that barrier and alter its performance. So there was also concern about radionuclide uptake as well, if roots would get down into the radon barrier or even deeper into the system, potentially bringing radionuclides up to the surface where they might be transported away by dying vegetation or vegetation that's consumed by wildlife and the like. So the system is an all-earthen profile, and importantly, the surface of it is managed with herbicide to preclude vegetation from establishing. That's a fundamentally different approach than used in almost all other waste containment systems, where vegetation is normally allowed to establish at the surface to provide long-term erosion control, water control, a variety, and aesthetic issues as well. So it's somewhat different. Here's an example of one of these facilities. This is actually at the Blue Water, New Mexico uranium mill tailings disposal facility. This is one of the facilities built as a byproduct of the UMTRCA legislation. We actually did a study here examining the radon barrier at this site. That you get a sense for how large these facilities are. This is 1,335 hectares. That's an enormous facility. This large gray patch here in the upper part of the figure, and this other large gray patch down here in the lower right-hand part of the figure. Those are two different cells. The main cell in the upper part has 16 million cubic meters of uranium mill tailings and associated radioactively contaminated debris. The surface is all riprap, just like I showed in the diagram. And you see that here on the right. This is actually a photograph of the surface. It's supposed to be sprayed for vegetation control. You can see some vegetation has been established on the site, so it's not a perfect system. The assumption is that the radon barrier in this system will retain its effectiveness over a service life exceeding 1,000 years. Now, if you look at that facility on the left, you should ask yourself a question. It really just jumps out from the in a stark contrast to the rest of the conditions in the surrounding landscape. And that surrounding landscape is arid. It's fairly aggressive. It looks like a kind of a tough environment for just about anything to persist. One of the things that we know when we engineer things, place engineered structures in nature, and the engineered structure contrasts the surroundings in a very substantial way, nature will tend to degrade that system over time to make it compliant or congruent with the surrounding conditions. Compliant or congruent. And so if you look at this cell that's been built here, expected to last for 1,000 years or more. And yet when you look at it just in that photograph, the engineered system is so different from the surrounding landscape. Immediately, you might wonder, how would this ever persist in its as-built condition or something close to it for 1,000 years? And in fact, nature probably wants to take that system and alter it over time so it becomes much more consistent and congruent with the surroundings. The profile in that cover is a simplified version of the profile I showed earlier. This is one of the earlier sites before the 1989 guidance document came out. And it's similar to what I showed. It's got a radon barrier at depth. It's a little thicker, 0.9 meters. It's got a bedding layer on top of that, and then the riprap on top of that. Importantly, early on, these were constructed without protection layers. And so you can imagine this system is even more vulnerable because I don't have that extra 0.6 meters of protection layer that I showed earlier above that radon barrier. It's pretty close to the surface. So you can imagine the system may change rapidly over time. One of the things that we've observed over the last 20 years when we look at engineered barriers in other types of containment systems that rely on dense compacted clays like radon barriers, is those systems tend to evolve significantly over time in response to something called petagenesis, which is essentially the combined effects of root water uptake, changes in pore pressure, changes in structure associated with water content changes in the engineered barriers affiliated with the vegetative activity. And just an example of how the engineered properties of how the properties of engineered barriers evolve, I show you here this graph on the left. This is actually data from engineered barriers analogous to radon barriers in other containment systems throughout the United States. And this is from another program that we conducted with US EPA and US NRC with some involvement from DOE called the Alternative Cover Assessment Program. But what this graph here on the left shows is the saturated hydraulic conductivity of that engineered barrier layer analogous to the radon barrier. And the hydraulic conductivity is just the rate at which it, indication of the rate at which it will transmit flow. And we tend to want that number to be low so that the rate of transmission of liquid or percolation of the underlying waste is small. And so we'll build the system with a low hydraulic conductivity, hoping that it remains that way over time. What we see, what this graph shows here is in-service saturated hydraulic conductivities after barriers have been in service in the field for a number of years. And these vary from site to site, how many years they were in service, and comparing that to the as-built condition here on the x-axis. And what if things didn't change, when we go back and look at the in-service hydraulic conductivity condition, it would be very similar to this, what I've highlighted as the green line here, going up and down the one-to-one axis on that graph, that the in-service condition would be very similar to the as-built condition. And that's exactly the opposite of what we see for most engineered barriers. In fact, the more impermeable they are when we build them, the more they change over time. And you can see the at the lowest as-built saturated conductivities, the in-service conductivities are 1,000 or 100 times higher than the as-built. So they've become more permeable over time. What's interesting as well is they tend to become more similar over time, suggesting that nature is altering these engineered barriers that we very carefully engineer and construct to be very impermeable, and putting them back into a state that's comparable to the hydrologic setting at the near surface of the Earth. The type of structure we see in these systems, we see here on the right in the photographs, cracks, fissures. Here's one from the field on the right, a crack in an engineered barrier. You can actually see a root down in that crack. Lots of alteration is occurring, and as a consequence, the barrier is becoming more permeable over time. So in conventional systems, not umtrica covers, there's lots of evidence indicating that change was afoot in engineered barriers, and they were likely going to be transmitting much more water than was ever anticipated. And I forgot to use my animation there, but I've shown here with just my last little bit there. I'm going to just go back one more time. Again, the green line would be if there was no change. And then this yellow band is what we actually see, that there's considerable change, and nature tends to make things more similar over time. So these observations and some other considerations led to the Grand Junction test facility, which is we're built right next to the Grand Junction disposal facility, which is a DOE EM, environmental management, disposal facility for uranium mill tailings and other contaminated, radioactively contaminated debris associated with uranium mills associated with historic parts of the weapons complex in the United States. And what we built at this facility were two different large-scale test sections to evaluate the efficacy of uranium mill tailing covers over time under different conditions. And as I showed earlier, a cover profile that's in the umtrica guidance from 1989, shown here on the left, in service profile, the one we looked at before. And we built one at our test facility that was fairly similar to what is in the DOE guidance. A couple of things that were different. We had a couple of different components here down at the bottom. I won't go into that. We didn't have any radioactive tailings underneath either. We built it just on top of fill. But our objective was to build that test cover profile, monitor it, and evaluate the percolation rate transmitted through the cover and into the underlying material over time. That was our first objective. Does it maintain low percolation rate over time? The second objective was to evaluate that vegetation management strategy where we're applying herbicide to preclude vegetation. That has a really high O&M cost. It's really intrusive. You have to have somebody out at the facility several times each year spraying the vegetation. It's not a very consistent approach with nature. We're essentially fighting nature with herbicide each and every year. So it's labor intensive. It's inconsistent with the natural system. How would this system function if we just stopped applying the herbicide and we allowed the vegetation to become established? And we call that allowing the system to naturalize, as opposed to fighting the system, fighting the natural conversion process. We're going to allow it to naturalize. And so we built a test facility, and I'll show photos of this in a minute. We had two different identical test areas. One managed conventionally, it's 20 meters long and 10 meters wide. And we're looking in an aerial or a plan view right now. The left is the conventional area. We managed this just following the DOE guidelines to the T, actually managed by personnel who managed the Grand Junction disposal facility. They managed the herbicide application on that one as well. On the right-hand side, we had an identical test area, which we allowed to naturalize over time. And we monitored the performance of these over time to evaluate how that naturalization would alter the performance. In the first 7 years, we managed them identically, essentially to define the control condition and to obtain a duplicate set of data for the hydrologic condition of this cover. So for 7 years, starting in roughly 2007, we applied herbicide on both, monitored both systems, and collected data from them. And I'll talk about that type of data in a minute. And then in 2015, we ceased applying herbicide on the naturalized area and allowed vegetation to become established, and continued and are continuing to this day to collect data from both of those. Those test sections, which I showed in plan view and cross section, look like a large bathtub. These are a so-called ACAP style drainage lysimeter, the lysimeter that was developed through the alternative cover assessment program I mentioned earlier. Essentially, we have a large bathtub in which we construct the cover profile. The bathtub is constructed out of high-density polyethylene geomembrane or thick plastic sheet. It's a textured 1.5 millimeter thick high-density polyethylene. It just goes all around the periphery. It's at the bottom in particular, allowing us to collect any liquid that percolates through the cover. We've got what's called a geocomposite drain directly on top of the geomembrane at the bottom. That's a drainage layer. It allows us to route any water that drains out the bottom into the sump and then into a pipe where it can be metered. We also have a sump and a collection system to measure any lateral flow. So you can imagine at the surface, we've got riprap, and when we have precipitation, liquid rain coming down, or we have snow melt, that will make its way down through that coarse riprap layer, hit the finer textured protection layer, and then flow laterally, and we can collect that lateral flow as well. This system, and internally, it's instrumented for state variables, for temperature, for matrix potential, for water content, and a series of nests with sensors at different depths. And so what this system allows us to do is just capture the entire water balance, monitor the hydrology of the entire system, and define essentially the field performance of a cover of that profile. It's just some photographs of what these look like. This is the Grand Junction disposal facility. Actually, if it's photographed, we could pan to the right, it would be just to our right. So we're right next door to it. This is the subgrade being placed prior to installation of the geomembrane. All right, so this would be like something similar to a transition layer. But you get a sense for scale of this experiment as well. This is a large experiment in the field. On top of that was placed the geomembrane that used to form those lysimeters. You can see actually we've got, this is the high density polyethylene textured geomembrane. The panels being welded together with a wedge welder. And then that geocomposite drainage layer being placed on top of that. That's what's shown here on the right. That's a highly structured, highly permeable drainage, synthetic drainage material that captures flow that comes out the bottom. And here we're filling on top of that drainage layer with the transition layer. And this is actually done with a bobcat. In the field, it's done with a larger scale loader, but essentially the same technique. So we're placing the transition layer, which is just a broadly graded, a miscellaneous fill, essentially a structural fill that's used at the base. Once that the majority of that layer was placed over the geomembrane, the sidewalls were folded up. If you remember, there's a wall all around the edge of the lysimeter, and that's what you see here. That's the textured geomembrane, and they're placing the transition layer right up against it. And there's some formwork around it. You can just see it a little bit later after it's been filled. Here on the left, the transition layer has been placed, the geomembrane sidewalls, they fell down a little bit over here. You can see they would have been pulled back up over the plywood prior to placement of the radon barrier. So it's all ready for the radon barrier to be constructed. It's been constructed on the right. You can see that over here in this photograph. The clay barrier has been placed. It was placed using the same method and same compaction specifications as employed at the Grand Junction disposal site, which you can see in the background of this photograph. That riprap layer you see in the back on a slope is the Grand Junction disposal, side slope of the Grand Junction disposal facility. And here we're actually taking some samples for hydraulic properties out of the radon barrier to understand our as-built condition. We placed the radon barrier, we built a protection layer on top of that, and then put the riprap, bedding layer riprap, not showing photographs of each layer being placed. This is when we're up at final grade. We've got the riprap placed. You get a sense for how big of an experiment this is here. This is a loader down in the front here, a large piece of construction equipment. On the left, you can imagine the lysimeter for the conventional area shown here on the left. That's just this blue box, and then the other blue box on the right-hand side for the naturalized test section as well. The flows from those lysimeters go to basins. You can just barely see them here. I'll show you a photograph of these in a minute. But all the flows that come out the bottom of those go to metering basins that allow us to measure flow rates out of this system to a precision of about 1/10 of a millimeter per year. As I promised, there's a photograph of the basins. You can see them close up here on your left. These are very large tanks. They're about a capacity of about 200 liters. And within them, we have a series of redundant systems to measure flows. We have tipping buckets, and for percolation, we actually have a in-series redundant tipping bucket with different levels of precision that allows us to validate our data. We've got pressure transducers to measure stage. We've got automated flushing systems with no moving parts that allow the system to work maintenance-free with very little intervention over long periods of time. And so this has been functioning with only annual maintenance for 16 years now. But that's what the inside of one of these basins looks like. And this actually is not the basin at Grand Junction. This is actually at the White Mesa uranium mill where I was earlier this week doing some calibration work for our studies on that mill. The system is instrumented. I mentioned we have sensors within the profile using water content reflectometers. That's a low frequency time domain method to measure water content. There's thermal dissipation sensors to measure matrix potential, and there's thermocouples to measure soil temperature as well. All the sensors, whether the embedded sensors or the flows in the basins, are metered with a data logger, along with a full meteorological suite. We've got the full set of meteorological data being collected by these various instruments here. And it's all powered by a solar panel, and the data collection is by cellular transmission. And you can see a little up close here of the size of the riprap on which that weather station has been placed, and that's the same riprap that's on the surface. This weather station is actually right in the middle of the test section. Okay, let's look at some data. Let's take a look at what we've observed. These are called water balance graphs. And what they describe are the different components of the water balance of the cover over time. And they're cumulative quantities. So we're looking at the accumulating amount of a particular water balance quantity over time. So for example, precipitation, that's the blue line. Well, that's the total amount of precipitation that's been recorded at that location over time. And so it's always increasing monotonically because we're always getting more and more precipitation. Percolation, the red line, that's the total amount of water that's flowing out the bottom of the test section that would go into the waste. The green line is lateral flow. That's what's flowing off the interface between the bedding layer beneath the riprap and the fine textured protection layer. That's a very small quantity relative to others. And then another quantity is what's called soil water storage. That's here in gold. That's the total amount of water that's stored within the cover profile. And we compute that by integrating the water content record spatially at any given time that we get from our water content sensors. And then finally, evapotranspiration, that's the flux that's coming off the surface back to the atmosphere. And we compute that by difference in essentially using a mass balance technique on the overall water balance. That's what these graphs show. And the left graph is from the conventional section, the right graph from the naturalized section. A couple of key things here early on. Percolation is the one we're most interested in, the red line. And you can see early on that the percolation rate is increasing total cumulative percolation is increasing very, very slowly, just creeping up over time. And that's because the percolation rate at any given time is very low. But around 2013 or so, it begins to change, and it becomes more episodic with larger jumps in the record. And they tend to increase over time, where the percolation rate actually increases substantially by 2015. So it transitioned from something of very low percolation with a very gradual slope of increasing percolation to something much more dramatic. The soil water storage record looks almost the same. It's just going up and down every year. It gets a little wetter in the spring, drier in the summer, wetter in the spring, drier in the summer. It's not, and in fact, it just looks like a mirror image throughout the entire record. Our precipitation record, fairly constant. You have wet years and dry years, but fairly consistent over time. But interestingly, the other component you see is that the black line, evapotranspiration, begins to deviate from precipitation right around that same time that the percolation rate is increasing. Why is that? Well, we're losing water through the system. It's actually making its way entirely through the cover as opposed to being stored in the upper layers and evaporating back to the atmosphere. So the system changed over time, and it changed within 6 years. Within 6 years, its behavior changed fundamentally. The naturalized section shows some similar types of performance, except for its change started earlier, within about 3 years of when the test section was constructed. Again, early on, very low percolation rate, but then it begins to step up. And then like the conventional, around 2015 or so, really the percolation rate picking up substantially. And the deviation between evapotranspiration and precipitation occurring as well. January 2015 is when we stopped applying herbicide. Right, so that's a fundamental change in the way the naturalized section is being managed. The conventional section being managed the same way as it was earlier on. The naturalized section, we stopped applying herbicide. Stopped applying it and allowed the system to essentially equilibrate with its surroundings. You'll notice that early on, after herbicides ceased, the record really didn't change. We still have this steep increase in percolation, right? Similar thing occurring over here on the conventional. But within about a year or a year and a half, the percolation rate began to cease. It was flatlined, right? The other thing we see is that the soil water storage, which was fairly constant early on, just oscillating up and down each year. Once we stopped applying herbicide, it starts to diminish. We're losing water from that system. It's drying out. So the percolation rate has dropped. The system is drying out. The soil water storage is diminishing. And notice as well that the evapotranspiration line and the precipitation line begin to converge again. So rather than deviating like we saw for the conventional, with precipitation more than evapotranspiration, here they begin to coalesce again and are approaching similarity at the end of the record. All right, so what's going on here? Well, it's all about the vegetation. Now, if you remember early on, as I mentioned, I'm gonna go back to this just for 1 second. We stopped applying herbicide in 2015, but it's still, we had a good bit of percolation throughout 2015 and into 2016. It's still draining a good bit. It wasn't after about into 2016 when it really flatlined. Well, what do we see? Well, early on, the first year, we stopped applying to vegetation. And we see in the upper graph, this is just ground cover. So you go out and run a survey and you look at what are the different conditions on the ground, relative fraction. You see it's predominantly rock. It's always going to be predominantly rock because the surface is rock covered. But we see some vegetation coming in. You see that's the green bar. So even immediately after ceasing herbicide, we get some vegetation that comes in early. But that vegetation typically was just leafy herbaceous vegetation. That's the yellow bars down below. And the lower graph shows the relative fractions of different types of vegetation. The yellow bar is herbaceous or leafy like grasses, and this was largely crested wheatgrass, I believe. I have to go back and look at my notes. But then it transitioned. We didn't get data in 2016. There was a snafu on that. But then in 2017, 2018, and further, we had vegetation, but the type of vegetation changed from a near surface herbaceous vegetation to a deep-rooted woody vegetation like the sagebrush and rabbit brush shown here on the right. This vegetation extends deep roots down into the profile and laterally between different surface areas of surface biomass, capturing the water that's below. And you can see over time the predominance of the woody vegetation and the diminishment of the herbaceous vegetation. The woody vegetation really became much more significant. You can see this, just really large vegetation biomass on the surface. Well, what did this do to percolation rates? Again, here I'm showing here on the graph at left. I've just taken the water balance data and I've annualized these from the graph earlier, and I show annual percolation. This is a function of time. I've got precipitation on the graph as well on the Y2 axis. That's shown in blue, the conventional test section in gray, and then naturalized in green. And early on, you see actually the naturalized transmits a little bit more percolation than the conventional. And then around 2014, 2015, that's when we saw these changes and these large increases in percolation rate, jumping up, as we showed earlier. And in fact, at that point, the conventional is transmitting more percolation than the naturalized section, but they're both transmitting much more percolation than was ever anticipated. And if you remember early on, I said 0 to 3 millimeters per year was the anticipated condition. In 2015, the conventional system is nearly 45 millimeters per year, so more than 10 times higher than expected. And in 2015, that's when we applied our different scheme where we would allow the naturalized section to naturalize. And we see in that section, which is the green bars, that while it took a year or so for that section to begin to get vegetation, the percolation from the naturalized section just flatlined off. We had some flow in 2019, but outside of 2016 and 2019, it's been essentially near zero, right around zero. Whereas our conventional section has continued to transmit percolation, particularly in 2019, transmitting almost 50 millimeters of percolation. We see that data over here on the right, which just shows the annualized percolation for the naturalized test section relative to the annual percolation for the conventional test section. And data that fall below that 1-to-1 line would be favorable conditions, that the naturalized is less than the conventional. And you see a couple of things here. The data are split into brown pre-2015, so brown not allowing vegetation, then green when we're allowing the vegetation to establish. And you can see all of the green dots fall into the favorable range. The percolation rate from the naturalized section is lower. And in fact, they're still fairly high soon after we apply the, start applying the scheme of no herbicide. But after 2018, essentially nil coming out the bottom. Again, very favorable percolation rates relative to the conventional section. And we see the same thing here as well. If we look at this graph, I'm going to probably just talk about this briefly. But what this graph shows is what in the wettest years, the annual precipitation is from the naturalized section is substantially lower than the conventional section after the herbicide application was ceased. This cover not only transmits less water after naturalization, but it's more resilient. It can handle these really wet years much better than the conventional cover can. You know, for example, if you look out here in 2016, that was a really wet year for Grand Junction, almost 300 millimeters of precipitation. And we've got 19 millimeters from the naturalized section and up on the order of 45 from the conventional. So it's just much more resilient cover in that much more extreme condition. Why does that occur? Well, essentially, the plants are drying out the system. So we see here, these are water contents at various depths over time. This is a conventional section. There are different depths in the profile. This blue, dark blue, and light blue, that's in the protection layer. The brown and green are in the radon barrier. You can see they're just oscillating up and down each year throughout the record, as I talked about before. In contrast, and they remain essentially the same throughout the entire record. Over here on the right, we see the naturalized section. They do the same behavior early on, but after we stop applying herbicide, the water contents plummet. They start to drop off. First in the protection layer, see at the top of the protection layer, and deeper in the protection layer, and then a little later in the radon barrier, all that system is drying out. Particularly deep down in the system, in the transition layer below the radon barrier, the water contents drop off as well. And that's commensurate with the percolation ceasing as well. So we're seeing the entire system dry out with the vegetation that's pulling that water up, it's sending it back to the atmosphere rather than having it migrate down through the profile over time. Why did the conductivities, why did the percolation rates increase? In 2013, we went and studied how the hydraulic properties of the protection layer and the radon barrier compared to what we saw early on. And we found from that evaluation that those layers became about 10 to 500 more times more permeable than they were in the as-built condition. And I'm going to just go over that briefly with this graph, but that was the cause. We went back and examined those layers, measured their hydraulic properties. Structure had developed in those layers over time. They had become more permeable within about 6 years of construction. Not 1,000 years, not 500 years, 6 years. They became much more permeable. That was largely due to these small oscillations in wetting and drying, we believe, and not due to freezing and thawing. We found the protection layer was very effective in protecting the radon barrier from freezing, but it was just these oscillations in water content, which I show over here on the right, we talked about earlier. Subtle, just wetting and dry the system, changes in pore pressure, changes in the volume, inducing structure in the protection layer and in the radon barrier as well. So some lessons learned. Radon barriers evolve over time. The assumption that they're going to remain constant for 1,000 years is not realized in practice. They are going to transmit more percolation into the underlying waste, and that's going to be substantially higher than the 0 to 3 millimeters that was originally proffered in documents predicting or expecting the performance of these systems. This occurs in armored covers in the same way that we see changes occur in conventional covers used in other types of waste streams. Thinking early on with the riprap on top and the application of vegetation, we're going to eliminate many of the pedogenic changes observed in other systems. That's not true. These systems evolve just like other final covers with engineered barriers. They become more permeable. They transmit more percolation over time. Importantly, allowing the system to naturalize, essentially just ceasing the application of herbicide, enhanced the performance substantially, which is in direct contrast to the original thinking that the vegetation was going to damage the system and degrade its performance. So allowing the vegetation to establish enhances the system, improves its performance, rather than degrading it. A paradigm shift of 180 degrees. A complementary study evaluated radionuclide uptake and found that that was essentially non-existent in these systems as well. Not at our test section, that wasn't part of our study, but a complementary study that DOE LM did as well. The other thing that we saw, and I talked about this briefly, is the naturalized covers are more resilient than conventional covers. Not only do they transmit less percolation, in the really wet years, they tend to be vastly superior. So they can handle the dry years and the wet years just equally well. They're really resilient regardless of the condition, whereas the conventional covers, not so much. And then finally, what's an interesting byproduct of all this, we get better performance. We create a system where we're not using herbicides, which is a more sustainable approach, but it costs less. We're not out there maintaining it year in and year out with herbicide. The O&M costs go down, the use of herbicides goes down. All of those are additional benefits on top of performance as well. So lots of important lessons learned from the project. All right, I'm going to stop there. And I got a couple minutes. I don't know if there's any questions or if there's anybody still on. I still have some folks. Good.
Thank you, Dr. Benson. I had a quick question about whether various forms of fungi or moss and lichens would be possibly applicable instead of plants, or if that's even been investigated.
Could you say that one more time? I apologize. I lost
Sure.
a little bit.
I was wondering
up there.
if instead of using plants as an additional top cover, if potentially various forms of fungi such as moss or lichens have been investigated as a different kind of vegetative state.
Right. I don't know. We do know that we get that type of biota, particularly in the lower parts of the riprap layer, because it's a moist environment, which tends to facilitate that type of biological growth. But their efficacy in terms of managing water hasn't been studied. I would suspect that it would be modest relative to the vegetation. If you saw that big plant I showed, just imagine all those surfaces covered with, which is like your skin, right? It's these stomates all over it, all of which are just pulling out water and shedding it back to the atmosphere. So I would expect it would be less, but they tend to be complementary as well. So we do know that both exist in the system.
Thank you.
Professor Benson, thank you for your presentation. I have a question. So we've been to the, we've done some lysimeter work together. I also interested in this. I didn't work on this, but I see the structure of the lysimeter. I know there's like a root barrier constructed in different layers. I just curious, what's what the logic behind it? Like where I should put this root barriers, because I bet in the desert area, root can have a long penetration, and I don't know, maybe that's a question. I'm just curious. So
good question, Nick. I'm glad you picked up on it. I should call you Professor Chen, like you call me Professor Benson. The root barrier is a thin layer of non-woven geotextile placed at depth, and it's got small polyethylene nodules bonded to it, heat bonded to it, and they're loaded with trifluralin, which is an organic chemical that slowly diffuses out, and it's a root inhibitor. So essentially what it does, it doesn't kill a plant or kill a root, but the roots come down and then they'll tend to move horizontally. And we put that at the mid depth of the transition layer at the very bottom, because we want to allow the roots to penetrate as far as they might in a natural system. But like you said, in a semi-arid environment, the vegetation it's biologically adopted to scrap and find every bit of water it can. And what we found in these systems without a root barrier, it actually go down into the drainage layer, down the pipe, into the basin. And so that it has that important function of preventing the roots from getting into the measuring system, which wouldn't happen in the field in a full-scale application. But we want to get it as deep as possible as we can, right? Because we want to allow that root system to penetrate as deep as it might in a full-scale application. So we tried to get it as close to the bottom, but above the lowest layers of geosynthetics.
Well, do you think this will, like some of the roots, if they can kind of create some paths for like radon gas emission, or this is not a case? Like
that roots can alter radon emissions?
No, I mean,
like,
I mean, not related to this, but I mean, for the root, if it penetrates very deep, create some. Do you think they're gonna create some paths for radon gas emission, like just a flow near this root? I don't know if this is a good question or not.
Get preferential.
Preferential
radon gas flux. We've found, we did a complementary study looking at radon fluxes over time, and found that in barriers that develop structure, the radon fluxes do increase. They don't increase nearly as much as the water fluxes do, right? So they'll be 5 times higher over time, and but not the 10 to 100 times higher we see with water flow. But as you get more structure, the diffusion coefficient essentially increases because the water saturation diminishes in the barrier system. In those larger pores, they become gas pathways. So you're spot on with that.
Okay.
That's another webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right. All right.
Craig, I want to jump in and say thank you for jumping in and doing this the last minute. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you asked me, Julie. I was fervently working my PowerPoint this morning to get ready, so I appreciate being asked.
Well, everybody, Josh had to step away for a minute. So thank you again, Dr. Benson. And before we all part and go off to enjoy our weekend, I believe Nick has a very brief announcement to make.
Yeah. So just a brief announcement. First, thank you, Dr. Benson, for giving the seminar. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Nick.
And just a quick announcement. I sent an email about Jocelyn's presentation next week. So there's a link in there. If you haven't signed up, please go sign up. That's on Tuesday, and well, everybody are welcome to sign in, and please feel free to join the seminar. yeah, that's a brief announcement. Thank you.
And I'll just add to that, please know the crest is directly under Jocelyn. So she's a really good speaker for y'all to get to know and understand kind of her perspective on the work we do.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie.
All righty. Well, thank you again, everybody, and have a lovely weekend.
Yeah, have a nice weekend.
Yep.